optimized for the size of the device that they're running on. So we introduced this notation called SWDP, and you'll see in there we said SW600DP. So when we build apps, Android apps here at Google, the way we distinguish between whether a layout is for phones or for tablets is that we say anything that's 600 DPs or greater is automatically considered a tablet and will receive a tablet layout. Anything less than that will receive the phone layout. Now, that smallest width description, we actually only added that in Android 3.2. So prior to that, if your app is running on prior to that, what you should do is use the large and extra large layouts as a way of describing, defining whether it's a tablet or a phone. In general, though, we think it's a practice you should move away from using just large and extra large. You're better off using smallest width. There aren't very many devices that are between Android 3.0 and 3.2 left anymore, because many of those tablets have already been upgraded to either 3.2 or newer to like 4.0 and upwards. But this is how we distinguish between the two. All right. So when we talk about touchscreen objects, we actually want to be able to specify how, the dimensions of that, and we actually often look at height. So we've defined in our metrics, in our research has found that when you say 48 dPs, it's actually a comfortable height for a touch element. When you start to get smaller than 48 dPs, you can get into a situation where people with bigger fingers might touch something and the system will recognize it as having touched something else. So 48 dPs is actually what we use as a height for all of our elements. And 48 dPs in terms of physical dimensions translates to roughly about 9 millimeters. Our research has found that you need to go between 7 and 10 millimeters in height for it to be comfortable. On top of having that height for your touch elements, we also recommend that you put some padding around your elements. So if you look at the button at the bottom, above the button there's a 4 dP gap, and below the bottom there's a 4 dP gap. And we're going to have that for every list item that we display. Similarly, if you look on the sides, so if you look at the little pencil icon that we have, let me just point to it here, around there we've put an 8 dP gap between all the controls so that you never get into a situation where the user tries to press the icon and accidentally hits the button instead, because we're leaving this padding in there. So moving on to the next metric. Now this diagram might look like, oh, there's so much here. You don't actually need to pay attention to too much of it right now. The most important bit are these blue vertical bars here. And you'll notice that they are actually, I'm not sure if you can read that in the hall, but that says 16. So we recommend having a gap of 16 dPs on either side of your UI. Now let me tell you why that is. It's when you hold a device like a phone in your hand with one hand, often as you're gripping the phone, your fingers are actually touching the side of the screen. So if you don't leave that gap of 16 dPs, you might have a situation where just by holding the phone, your app is registering input events on controls that the user doesn't intend to click or touch. So it's really important to leave that gap of 16 dPs, or a dead zone as we like to call it. So let's talk about some best practices just to wrap up this section. When you're defining layouts, use wrap content, fill parent, or DP units when specifying the width and the height. Don't ever use pixel values. Pixel values will not scale well across different devices. As I mentioned, it's that whole density problem that you get into. And at the end of the day, what you want to do is build Android apps that run on as many devices as possible. So DPs really are the right way to do it. We have different layout containers, relative layout, linear layout, grid layout. We have this old one called absolute layout, which was there in version 1 of Android. We've deprecated it a long time ago, but there's still some developers that use absolute layouts. The answer is you shouldn't, because they use pixels. You have to specify everything in pixels with absolute layouts. and that's not a good thing to do, as we've just described. Now, we talked about those different buckets of LMDPI, HDPI, XHDPI, and there's a couple of others. Those buckets are used for you to specify assets, so things like graphics for your app. Now, when you're building an Android app, you should develop or build assets for each of those buckets, or as many of those buckets as you can. Because you don't want a really high resolution, like XHDPI asset to show up on an LDPI screen. It's not that it won't scale to fit, but the thing about doing that is that if you think about an LDPI screen, so it's a small device, it's usually a lower end phone, it's limited with its CPU speed, it's limited with its RAM. If you're passing in XHDPI assets, you're putting a lot more pressure on the system at runtime to scale that image for you. So your app is actually, it's already running on a low-end device, on a slower device, and now you're making it run even slower by putting all these high-res assets. Similarly, you shouldn't put only LDPI assets, because when people run that app on a bigger device, on a newer, faster device, it's going to look bad because it's a low-resolution asset. So ideally what you should do is generate your assets and then convert them for each of those buckets. It's really important. Now, Tony's going to tell us about the action bar.
Yep, thanks, Anka. So, in the Android platform, at the system level, the main way to do navigation is through what we call the navigation bar. And on tablets, we are using something, we have the system bar. But in the application level, the action bar is the most common way for user to interact with all the application. So if you look at all the Google applications, they are all using action bar in some way or other. And for an action bar, there are 4 major components. The app icon, so this is where your company logo, your brand should put in. And it also do something what we call back or up navigation within your application. The second thing is view control. So this is where there is a spinner, you can allow your user to switch between categories, or if your application support different accounts, this is where you allow your user to switch account. And the third thing is action buttons. So this is what before Honeycomb, what people are familiar with the option menus. So in terms of development, if you are already using option menus in pre-Honeycomb, this is what exactly will become when you activate the action bar. So all your option menu in the past will become action items, action buttons in the action bar. And the final component is what we call action overflow. Because as you can see the example here, we don't have all the real estate to show every single action buttons, right? So for the ones we can show on the bar, we all put inside this overflow menu. Next slide, please. So as you can see, another benefit of using the action bar is it automatically we size to fit all different form factors. And then there are also like couple of UI options you can configure, which I will talk about later. But here, like if you have a phone, you will see like all the action items can be put at the lower bottom of the phone. If you're on the landscape mode, the action items, the action buttons will go back up to the above, and same thing for tablet. Next slide. We also introduced something new called stack action bar. So for the spinner, instead of putting the spinner right next to the app icon, now you have a choice to create a stack action bar to have it put it right under the action bar as a second row. So a good example of using this is in our YouTube application. We are using the stack action bar. Next slide, please. Another form of the action bar is called split action bar. So you see the main action bar is still on the top, but if you enable the UI option split action bar when narrow, the action items will automatically put at the lower bottom of your screen. Next slide. So for the action buttons, how to decide which action items should put to make it available to the users? Because there are at most like 2-3 action items buttons you can put on the screen, and so we need to have some sort of criteria to make the decision. So here is a good scheme you can use, what we call fit scheme. So the first thing you want to consider is how frequent that action is done by your user. Is it more than 70% time? Is it constantly repeat? Or is it something like if you put it inside the overflow menu will give your user extra burden? So these are the things you should consider. If this is something that particular action fit this criteria, you should put it outside of on the action bar. The next thing to consider is how important that action is. And the third thing is it really typical for your kind of application showing that action relative to your competitors' application? If this is something a standard practice, for example, the search action, in most applications, this is like a first-class citizen. So it makes sense to put it on the action bar rather than hide it inside the overflow menu. Next slide. So for the overflow menu, if you are using something pre-honeycomb, so there are when you compile your application and the application run in the newer version of Android, in the navigation bar there will be a special overflow button showing up on the navigation bar, just like the one showing on the diagram. I think, Anka, can you click the slide? Yep. One more, please. So here's how it looks like on the navigation bar. So the extra legacy for legacy purpose, we have an option menu. So when you compile your application with an SDK older than Honeycomb, before Honeycomb, the legacy button will show up on a post Honeycomb device. So this is something we want to remind developer, especially your application can be compiled to a later version. So in your manifest, you should always target the latest SDK, and because in some case, like not all applications are using the option menu, but you want to completely avoid that legacy icon, especially when you are not using option menu. So make sure you always try to target the latest SDK. Next slide. So.
Okay, meanwhile, small little announcement.
We introduced
just, if you have any of the questions,
ICS.
Our volunteers are going to give you a piece of paper. Make sure you write the question on that, and we're going to answer your question. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So one thing we also introduced in ICS is what we call shared action provider. So we know a lot of developers use sharing a lot in a lot of the applications, and we want to make it easier. So that's why we introduced a component called action provider. So this is something configure in the option menu XML. So you just specify using this share action provider. And as you can see in the screenshot here, there will be a little like 3 dots icon showing up on the menu, and the right next to the icon right now is showing Gmail, but this is going to be the most frequently used sharing application the user use on his particular device. So this is something dynamic. So the whole component is already built for developers, so it's really easy. Just a couple lines of code, you can enable the share action provider in devices like after ICS. So about action bar icon, there are a couple of things you need to remember. One is the size of the icon is 32 by 32 dp, but we always want to leave some padding on the icon. So the effective size is really after saving the padding is really 24 by 24 dp. In terms of style for the icon, always use a flat icon with not too much detail. And if your icon is really sharp and thin, consider to rotate it 45 degrees. So in the example here, the pencil icon is a good example since it's thin. So it's better off to rotate that like 45 degrees. And finally, for colors of action bar icon, always use grayscale color. Yep. So the next things I want to talk about is notification. So in our previous session, we introduced the reach notification, and I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about reach notification. So pre-Jelly Bean, we already have this base layout. So we have the icon of your application or the photo of the notification of the user, the from user. We also have the title, the name, and the timestamp. The secondary icon is mainly when you use the primary icon for your for the sender of the notification. Then the secondary icon will be the one for the application icon. So there's nothing much change on the base layout in Jelly Bean, and everything you develop for notification pre-Jelly Bean is still compatible in the new version. So it's basically forward compatible. So in Jelly Bean, we introduced something we call the expanded layout. So this expanded layout can be expanded through gesture. So either through a pinch zoom or a 2-finger glide. And then we also make actions. So next slide, please. So we also make actions on notification of first-class citizen now. So you can use add actions in your notification natively. In the past, you can also achieve similar thing in the past through custom view, but now action is something built into the framework. So you can use action to handle like most common tasks. Like in this case, for a calendar, you can use it to snooze a calendar event, and it really makes triaging like notification much easier, because a lot of the actions user can do even without going to the original application. So it's really simple. So one thing to keep in mind for actions, do not abuse it. so some of the good actions you can consider is you can use the same fits criteria to decide what is important, what should be included as an action. In most cases, like good actions are some of the actions which is like time critical. The bad ones would be like something maybe too complex, like ambiguous to the user. It's not straightforward what the user will do by clicking on the action, or even something like duplicate the default action, which is like when you click on a notification, it basically opens your application, right? So you don't have to create another icon just for opening your application. Anchor, I think we lost the screen share. So give us a few minutes.
I'm coming back, sorry.
Yeah. So we need to think of something to entertain the audience in the meantime. Last time it...
That's okay, keep talking, Tony, it's just coming up.
So the next things I want to talk about is there are a couple ways you can interact with notification. So usually is you see the notification coming from, of course, the notification bar at the top, and the slide is back. Okay, cool. So the first way you interact with notification is through the notification bar, and in tablets we also have the notification bar on the lower right-hand corner, so which is part of the system bar. And there are also different types of notifications, and one of them is what we call ongoing notification. So this is something when you play a music, and you want the player keep showing on the notification bar, and it will not go away. So a couple things like which is not meant for notification is next. Can you click on it, Anchor? Is dialogues and talk. So these things are not really notification, and so when you happen to have some information, it's better to serve to the user through dialogues or talk. Make sure you use the right tool instead of using notification. Next slide. So when to use notification? So notification is meant to be not intrusive. So for time-sensitive events or involve other people, those are the times like you want to show notification to the user. Next slide. So when not to use a notification? So if it's not something like directed to the user, if it's not time sensitive, or the information is already like visible. For example, your application is already running on the front, so you don't want to do extra notification while the user is already on your application. And low-level things like some loading or status change, that kind of low-level work should also not be a notification also. Something like error message, those are probably not a good idea also to use a notification. Sorry, actually, can you guys still see the screen?
Keep going.
Okay. So now the next things I want to talk is the design. How to design the right right notification. The first thing is you have to make the notification really personal. So it's really something time sensitive or personal, directly relevant to the user. And when the user click on the notification, it should go to the right spot in your application. So for example, in Gmail, when someone click on an email notification, it should go straight to that conversation. And also, notifications should clean up intelligently. What I mean by that is, if the user goes to your application before looking at the notification, those notifications should just go away, right? Because the user already in your application and seeing all the things they need to see. Another good example of cleaning up intelligently is for calendar events. If the event is already passed, it's probably a good idea to remove those notifications because it doesn't matter to the user anymore. Remember in the What's New talk, we talked about priority of notification. So now we introduce like 5 different level of priorities: max, high, default, low, and minimum. They serve different purpose. Like maximum is really for things really urgent, like for example, navigation, turn-by-turn directions, ongoing telephone call, things like that. High, what we consider high would be like SMS or chat message, which require the user to have a direct response. And for low or minimum priority is something is for information purpose, not really too important to the user, but nice to have on the of time. So with this priority, new priorities, the notification tray will, based on these priority, to order all the notifications, and of course by time as well. And the new notification framework will always display the most important notification, the first one in the expanded mode. So so if you develop a notification in Jelly Bean, make sure you take advantage of this expanded option. So also make sure you stack your notification. So if you have 2 notifications, please don't show them both together side by side, just like this example. What you should do instead, you should stack them up like what we are showing here. So instead of showing 2 notifications, just show 1 and indicate the multiple notification with that little number on the lower right corner. And finally, there is another thing we call a sneak peek, of your notification. It's a really nice feature. Developers should take advantage of this nice little feature here. It's really useful and give the user some very informative information on that quick peek. Okay. Next slide. About icons. So for notification icons, it's 24 by 24 dp. We also again want to leave some padding, 1 dp per side. So the effective size is 22 by 22 dp. The style again is flat and simple, and for color, it's entirely white. So I saw some application they create like notification with colors icons. So don't do that. Notification icons are meant to be just white only.
Yeah, I just want to add something there. You'll notice that we've used a picture there. So in Google Talk notifications, we've used a photo of the person. And that goes back to something Tony said earlier. which is making notifications personal. So if somebody has sent a Google Talk message or an SMS or has called, it's quite important to actually show that person's profile photo as opposed to just the app, because that's what's most important or most relevant to the user. But if it's not something like using an avatar of that person, you should be using entirely white icons.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay. So then, the next topic I want to talk about is multi-pane layouts. Next slide. So this is something what you will use when you start to design or develop a tablet application. And so before tablets, real estate on phone is quite limited. So if you want to go from a list view to look at a particular contact list user detail, you have to jump from one activity to another. So just like an example here. But with the introduction of tablets, you can now user can now see both the list and the detail view all together in one single page. And this is really much more user friendly and much better user experience. But how to achieve this? And the answer is through fragments. And there are a couple of strategies we want to make sure developers are familiar with when they design multi-pane layout. So the first strategy, what we call stress and compress. It's really nothing special. It's just like in landscape and portrait mode, in landscape mode is pretty much just compress the item and showing fewer items. And while in portrait mode, you just expand the list further down. It's nothing too special. The next strategy I want to talk about is called the stack strategy. So we are using this in our calendar application. So as you can see in the diagram here, in the portrait mode, we are really basically using a linear layout, vertical linear layout. And in the landscape mode, we are using another linear layout, but it's horizontal, in a horizontal linear layout. So we arrange like fragments to optimize the UI to make the best use of all the real estate. So in portrait mode, it's best fit to have the month calendar at the bottom, whereas in the landscape mode, it's better to put it on the right. The third strategy I want to talk about is called expand and collapse. So, and we are using that in our Google Talk application. So when we are in a conversation in the portrait mode, we will collapse the contact list and just show the user icon and part of the names, because like when the user on this mode, we really want the user to focus on the conversation, right? At the same time, we still want to show part of the list, so we don't want to hide it completely. Next slide. The last strategy is really go one step further of the collapse and expand strategy. We actually just in Gmail, in the portrait mode, we completely hide the inbox, the inbox list. And so there is the way to unhide the inbox is user can still click on the app icon on the action bar, and that can make the inbox reappear. So that's all for strategy we want developer to remember. and Anchor is going to talk about backwards compatibility.
Thanks, Tony. So you've seen a bunch of great stuff in this design talk about building modern Android applications that are highly interactive and really provide an intuitive experience. But you might be wondering that, well, how do you take these great new ideas and build them in a way that are available to older devices? Because not everyone is running Ice Cream Sandwich or Jelly Bean. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So firstly, we're going to talk about the virtual navigation controls. Tony mentioned that we have this action overflow button now, and it's something that we do use in the action bar, but we use it on devices like the Galaxy Nexus, which doesn't have a physical menu button. So on the screenshots here, you'll notice that the Galaxy Nexus has the back, home, and recents button at the bottom, but no physical menu button. So that's when we would show the action overflow. The great thing about that action overflow is that we will adjust based on the style of device that you have. We won't show that action overflow if the device has a physical navigation button. So here we've got a layout of a Nexus S, which actually has a menu key. So at runtime, we'll detect, well, the device has got a physical menu key, so we don't need to show the action overflow because it achieves the same purpose. And we don't want to have redundant UI here. So we'll adapt. The other thing I want to mention is legacy apps. So Tony actually did cover this slightly, which he said is when you're targeting which SDK to build your app with, you should always build against the latest version of the SDK. Now, the reason for that is that we will build it so that it incorporates some of these intelligent features like the action overflow button. And there are other things as well, such as hardware acceleration, which we haven't really covered today. So when you're running a legacy app, an app that's been built on a version of Android that doesn't know about the action overflow button, what you'll have is that you will get a menu button on devices like the Galaxy Nexus that don't have a physical menu button. So it's really up to developers to start targeting the newer versions of Android when they rebuild their apps so that you do benefit from all of the improvements that we're adding to the platform.
Yeah, one thing I want to add to this is I think some developer may have some misconception about the target SDK. In fact, like if you target the latest SDK, that doesn't mean your application couldn't run in some old Android version. So as long as you are not using the features or APIs in the latest release, your application will just run fine on any old Android release. So I think I know a lot of developers. The reason why they decide not to bump up the version is they have that kind of misconception. Things will just not work if they try to compile the APK with the latest SDK.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So we've also talked about the action bar, and really we want to emphasize how important the action bar is because it does provide a great user experience. So you might be wondering, well, okay, how do I use the action bar in newer versions of the platform? Our Android SDK actually includes a sample app that has called Action Bar Compat, which has a set of classes that you can go and include in your own app. It's a very thin wrapper, and it does provide a backwards compatible action bar going all the way back to Android 1.5. Now, it's not totally complete, but at Google I/O we announced that we will be coming up with a newer version of a backward compatible action bar, which is fully backwards as well as provides the full set of capabilities of the existing action bar. So until we make that available, you can either choose to use this action bar compat or use one of these open source community projects. One of them is called Action Bar Sherlock, and developers that use it have praised it quite highly, so certainly check that out. We talked about fragments. Tony really tried to show you how valuable they are because it does allow you to build really flexible user interfaces that translate between phones and tablets so that you can have a single code base and you don't have to do too much differentiation between when your app is running on a phone versus running on a tablet by encapsulating in these components called fragments. So fragments can be reusable UI components, but they can also be used as non-UI objects that you just use in memories, in memory rather. Now, when you use fragments, you can basically drop them in your layouts. And what the way we like to think of fragments is kind of like a section of your app. So, you know, you're grouping relevant pieces of functionality into a fragment. And then when your phone app is running on a tablet, you'll be showing multiple fragments at the same time to make better use of the extra screen space that you have. So the great thing about the fragments is that we actually provide a fully backward compatible fragment in something that we call the support library, which we're going to talk about. We also have this concept of something called a view pager, and if you look at this animation here, what we're actually doing is swiping left to go between the pages, and at the top you see icons, they're tabs. The way the view pager works is that you can not only swipe those pages, but you can actually tap those tabs to have an animation that looks like you've swiped to that page. It's a really nice user experience to be able to swipe across the different pages of your apps. And again, the view pager is a class that we provide in the support library. So now let's talk about that support library. It's a library we introduced to incorporate these newer features like fragments, like the view pager, and provide it in a way that developers can just include the library in their app and get these great new benefits. So like the view pager is a fantastic example because it's actually not available yet on any version of the Android platform. So the view pager isn't a class that you even have in Jelly Bean. It's only available through the support library. And that's really the power of the support library. Not only do we provide backward compatibility through things like fragments and loaders, but we're also able to put in newer things like the view pager, such that you can use it in the oldest versions of Android, so including Android 1.6. The great thing about the support library is to include it. All you have to do is right-click your project within Eclipse, go into Android Tools and say go and add the compatibility. It used to be called the compatibility library, but now it's the support library. And when you go and right-click and add that option, it will download the library, add it to your path, include it in your project, and you can start using the namespace straight away. It really couldn't be easier. So that's about backward compatibility. The last thing we're going to talk about before we wrap up is pure Android. So a lot of you might be wondering, well, look, I build cross-platform apps. I want to build apps that I want on iOS or Windows Phone or Android. The important thing is that you should ensure that those apps provide a native experience on the relevant platforms. So here we have an example of controls, the same controls on Android, iOS, and Windows Phone 7, and you'll notice they have a very distinct look and feel across the platforms. So when a user downloads an Android app, they're going to feel a lot more comfortable with an Android experience. And the same goes for an iOS app for iOS experiences. So it's really important that you do put the user first. It's all well and good to have cross-platform applications, but you want to make sure that you're respecting the user by providing them an experience that they are familiar with, because otherwise they're going to feel alienated. So don't mimic UI from other platforms. Building on the UI thing is icons. So here we've got a set of icons, Android, iOS, and Windows Phone 7, and each of those columns actually represents the same action. So we have share, search, back, delete, refresh, and bookmark. And you'll notice each of them have different icons. If you use icons from different platforms on the wrong platform, then users are going to get confused. Users are expecting to see the share icon be the same across all of their Android apps. They're not expecting to see share icons from other platforms. And the same applies for any type of action that you take. So keep that in mind when you're building cross-platform applications, that you're tailoring the experience for the user's platform. So another example that we notice as a differentiator, Android tends to have tab bars at the top, but iOS tends to have tabs across the bottom. So that's a straightforward, it alienates the user because the user is expecting to see on Android, expecting to see their tab navigation across the top. So keep these things in mind. Back buttons are another important differentiator because Android devices come with back buttons. you don't need to have, and you shouldn't have labeled back buttons on your user interface. There's an important point to note here, and that is the distinction between a back button on the device in Android and the up button that you see in the action bar. Now, we don't have time to go through that in great detail today, but you should have a look at the Android design site to see the nuances between the difference between a back button and an up button. The final thing that you should not do on Android is put in right point carrots. So an example of it is the settings screen on Android versus the settings screen on iOS. You'll see that on Android, everything that we list there, we've made it prominent because they are all selectable items. So anything there with an icon, for example, and larger, bolder text is actually something that opens the next screen. We don't need a right caret to distinguish between something that navigates to the next page and something that is just an item on the current screen. We use different ways to do that. So it's something that you should avoid doing on Android. So we talked about the don'ts. Let's talk about the do's. If you haven't if you haven't realized it yet, you really should. That action bars are a great way of building intuitive user experiences. So really adopt them as soon as you can. As we mentioned, there are multiple ways you can have backward compatible action bars, and it really will make your app look modern and feel intuitive. Android provides you many ways to have context-aware applications. So things like you can register for intents when the user has connected to a new access point is on Wi-Fi. That's when you can queue your data transfers. Or you can be notified when the user's location changes or when another app asks for a location change. So you don't have to ask all the time, for example. It's also very important that to realize that you can preload data, and you should. Because there's nothing more frustrating to a user than when they fire up your app and they have to wait a little while for you to go and fetch the relevant data. It's always best to be fresh and up to date automatically. So what your app should do is, as soon as the user fires up your app or navigates to a particular screen, you populate the user interface with whatever data you've already preloaded, and then at the same time you go and request the next batch of data. So the user isn't sitting there waiting. And as we've been sort of emphasizing, user experience is what is most important. So focus on it. Look at things like fragments. Look at things like flexible user interfaces. Use DPs. Offline support is similar to the preload data scenario, where it's great to have an app that can access the internet. But what happens when it's not available? Should the user have to suffer or not use your app if they're in a location where their 3G connectivity is low, or they're in flight mode when they're on an aircraft? So keep that in mind. Gmail is probably the gold standard for providing great offline support, because when you use the Gmail app, you can't actually tell the difference between when you're offline and when you're online. When you're offline, it presents you with whatever data it had when it last preloaded it, and you can compose and send new messages. It will just delay the sending to when it has connectivity. But it's all transparent to the user. It doesn't prompt the user to say it's offline, do you want me to queue it? It just does the right thing automatically. It's intelligent. Well, that concludes our definitive Android design presentation. Thank you very much for tuning in. And at this point, we'll like to open it up for some questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Ankur.
Yeah.
So a huge round of applause again for this gentleman. So before we go on to our Q&A, there are a lot of questions out here. Can you quickly let the audience know, there are 1,000 developers out here, what's the best way to get in touch with you, and how can they hang out with you on a weekly basis?
Yeah, no problem. So Google Plus is where we can be found. If you just look us up by our names, you'll find us. We've got our photos there as well, so in case there's some duplicates, you can certainly see who the right people are. We have a weekly hangout that we run on Thursdays. It's on at 11:30 a.m. Indian Standard Time. So again, if you just follow Plus Android Developers on Google Plus, you will see our weekly show, and you can tune in, or you can even participate if you choose to.
Okay, yep. Cool. So there are some questions for you. do you see any convergence between Android and Chrome OS? And if a native app is developed on Chrome OS, can it be easily ported to Android?
Sure. Tony, do you want to grab this?
Yeah, so I think the Android platform and the Chrome and Chrome actually serve kind of different purpose, and I think application in terms of applications, I see developer like trying to build web apps and that or have a platform that can share like contents of between the web and Android. Certainly there are some kind of convergence, and but at the end of the day, I think a laptop and a mobile phone really serving different purposes. So I guess there are something the two platforms can share definitely. Things like, for example, we have an application if you're using a Chrome browser, and it will automatically sync all your bookmarks, or even like launch an intent to launch an application browser on your mobile phone on what kind of stuff you see on Chrome. So things like this kind of stuff we can definitely do a lot better in the future. Anka, anything to add?
No, I think you covered everything, Tony.
Okay. And the next question is, does Android support Indian language fonts?
Yes, in fact, it's improved with, in Ice Cream Sandwich, we improved the font support there as well. So it does support it. It's getting better and better. Ice Cream Sandwich has new fonts for it as well.
Okay. So every time I deploy a new version on Amazon App Store, I'm forced to port my in-app purchase code, or I'm forced to maintain multiple copies of the app, and version control becomes a problem. Is there a thought process of making purchases as a framework where implementers can bind logic at runtime?
I guess nothing that I know of or certainly can share. I mean, these sorts of things, when you look at these sort of billing systems, they are truly very strongly coupled with the places where you choose to publish your app. So there are going to be differences, and that maybe is something that will lead you to make your decision as to whether you want to support multiple stores or you want to pick one store over another or not. There is no industry-wide standard that I know of that you can code to.
Okay. Is there a way we can design the notification center with grid view rather than the list view for big screen devices?
Notification center. So in terms of notifications, you provide a content view. You don't provide a list view. You can choose to, I guess, but what you would typically be doing is using just a content view. And at that point, you can choose what you want.
Yeah.
What are the tools that you're providing to test Android applications other than Monkey Tool?
So testing is an interesting facet. I guess we talked a little bit about developer tools in the previous talk, and we are certainly providing ways for you to see your layouts and so on for different device configurations. Mm-hmm. Other than the sort of Monkey Runner tool, you've got your Android test projects as well. That you can set up, and you should be having automated test cases for your Android apps. And I guess I do know of third-party services that allow you to provide an APK and a script, and they will run it on a series of physical devices, but that's not something that we do ourselves.
Okay. So everyone is moving to HTML app development. So what's the use of Android SDK, or we stick to just one platform?
Tony?
I think in previous session we also covered that too. Like also, it really depends on the nature of your application, right? I mean, if you already have a HTML backend service or web application in place, like it makes a lot of sense to build web view application or even just accessing your system through the browser. But on the other hand, like if you're looking into like expanding the user experience like through different sensor on the phone, I think still the native route is still the stronger way to go at least at the moment. So I guess it really depends on what you want to deliver to your user.
Yeah, and I'll just add on top of that that if you've got very media heavy or apps that are like basically games, you're not going to be able to. I mean, if they're basic games, sure, a web app will do, but there is no WebGL on Android yet. But so if you're building games, you're not going to be able to do that with JavaScript. So it really depends on the style of app that you have and your own expertise.
Okay, and here's the last question. The Android app that I'm developing consumes a lot of memory. What tweaks do you suggest to develop less memory consumable apps?
Tony?
Yeah, so when you set your application using a lot of memory, I think there are a couple of ways, things you want to look at. Like first, well, a couple of things like, for example, like is your application like really graphic intensive? Like in that case, it's probably acceptable to have your application use more memory. But the other case would be, is there any memory leak or your code is not actually optimized? So in those cases, probably you should use some like memory profiling tool we offer to troubleshoot these if that's the case you're having there.
Okay, so that's it from Hyderabad. So thanks a lot. And again, a huge round of applause to Ankur and Tony, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Ankur and Tony, I'll see you at Delhi in 2 weeks from now.